all right. That's a Grand Cross by um, Gloria's band. They're just blanking on it. Ringmaster is the name. So hi, I'm Jayme CheeseSlice, and I'm here to host. Well, I'm here to introduce you to Uncontrolled Opposition for today. Um, we're going to be talking about Jeremy's new book on political assassinations. But first, I want to let you know if this is the first time you've ever watched Uncontrolled Opposition, we are first and foremost a radio program. We have to record for WBAI and the Progressive Radio Network, and it goes up on those channels a week from now. But we have to record it anyway, so we do it live here on YouTube, and you get to see the whole thing uncut, and you get a little bit more than what goes onto the radio show because we usually go over. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and bring on our hosts, Gloria and Jeremy. How are you guys doing today? It's good to see you.
Hey,
Put you on
Jayme.
the number one spot.
Hey, Jeremy.
All right, we're going to do about 55 minutes, and at the end of that, we're going to flash the title card again just so I have an editing point. And then if there's anything else left to talk about, we'll keep talking about it. But this is Jeremy's book. He's been working on it really hard for over at least a year. I don't know how many years has it been? Like 2 years?
It's been at least 5 years. I mean, not
Five
the
years.
sole thing I'm doing, but I've researched this topic at least 5 or 6 years or
Yeah.
more.
So I'm sure you got a lot to say about it. And we're gonna get as much about it out of your head today as possible. All right. So Gloria, take it away. You're on the clock.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. The opinions you hear are ours, not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. Today, we are going to talk about political assassinations, not a series of isolated tragedies, but as a recurring system. Jeremy Kuzmarov's latest book, titled Political Assassinations in America, The Intricate Nexus of Deep State Crimes, examines a long list of high-profile political murders. Each case is important on its own. The death of Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Kennedy, and others changed the course of nations. But what's even more enlightening, what the book forces us to confront, is the pattern that keeps appearing around those deaths. Professor Kuzmarov does not claim every case contains every element. Methods of killing vary. What remains remarkably consistent is the surrounding architecture. First, the victim is politically consequential, someone positioned to threaten existing power, intelligence interests, financial structures, or the status quo itself. Second, authorities rapidly present a lone, often deranged or ideologically unstable perpetrator. The focus stays on that single individual. Third, there are usually anomalies or failures in security beforehand. Protectors absent, reassigned, or ineffective. Security systems with components missing or disabled in ways that only become glaring afterwards. Fourth, key evidence is suppressed, mishandled, or disappears. Investigations that follow tend to reinforce the official narrative rather than rigorously testing competing possibilities. Fifth, witnesses, journalists, and investigators who challenge that narrative face pressure, marginalization, or worse. Dorothy Kilgallen's story is one of the clearest modern examples. Meanwhile, the media converges quickly around the official explanation, and protecting national security or defending patriotism is often invoked to close further inquiry. And finally, the outcome that matters most And finally, the outcome that matters most, the death, produces a consequential political change. Leadership shifts, policy changes, a movement is neutralized. Professor Kuzmarov calls these deep events, actions that alter or prevent political transformation. The pattern in one sentence is this: a threatening political figure, unusual security features or failures, an apparent lone perpetrator, a rapid official explanation, suppression of contradictory evidence, a compromised investigation, media reinforcement, critics discredited, and political consequences that benefit other interests. That sequence is more revealing than any single method of killing because the pattern is diagnostic. When high-value political targets die under suspicious circumstances, we should look beyond the Mockingbird media's sole focus on the identity of the shooter. We should immediately examine surrounding conditions. Was the victim positioned to produce major political change? Were there unusual gaps or reassignments in security in the hours, days, or weeks before? How quickly did the lone actor narrative solidify? Is evidence being restricted or disappearing? Are independent investigators being sidelined while the official story is amplified? And most importantly, who gains power or policy advantage from this death? Those questions do not require conspiracy theories. They require professional skepticism and systematic pattern recognition. Professor Kuzmarov's book is not merely a historical study, it's a diagnostic tool. It shows us that political assassination is rarely just the act of a single disturbed individual. It is often the visible tip of a deeper political event, one designed to shape outcomes. If we learn to recognize the fingerprints early, we improve our ability to protect the people who are still alive, to demand better investigations when protections fail, and to prevent the next deep event from being written off as just another tragic lone gunman. That's the real value of the work. Individual cases teach us history. The pattern teaches us how power sometimes operates. And once we see the pattern, we are harder to surprise. Thank you. Jeremy, please walk us through some of the key murders you detail in your book. Published by, let's do that one more time. Jeremy, please walk us through some of the key murders you detail in your book, published by Clarity Press on July 15th, titled Political Assassinations in America, the Intricate Nexus of Deep State Crimes. Should we try that one more time? Did we lose
Jeremy is having to log in with a different.
Yeah, I had to log in with my
camera.
phone because I was having some turbulence on the other one.
Okay,
Okay,
I'm
I
just
think we're
going to
good now.
take us back to this. Thank you. Jeremy, please walk us through some of the key murders you detail in your book, published by Clarity Press on July 15th, titled Political Assassinations in America, the Intricate Nexus of Deep State Crimes.
Well, thank you, Gloria, and thanks for that excellent introduction. And yeah, I think you make the key point that the book is novel in showing this pattern and, what we should look for. It's kind of a guide for the president as to what to look for, because there is a fairly consistent pattern, even if the method of assassination may differ. But there's a whole toolkit of them to be familiarized with, and also the elements of the cover-up. That's where we see a lot of consistency, including the labeling of critics as conspiracy theorists or worse. And yeah, these are deep, and I owe credit. The book, one of the book people it's dedicated to is Peter Dale Scott, who was a pioneering researcher in this field of deep politics, which is, I think, a growing field of inquiry and will be in the future. Um, and Scott coined that term, deep politics and deep event. And he was, addressing things like Watergate, the Kennedy assassination, that these had, both Kennedy assassinations, that they fundamentally re-altered American politics, sometimes for generations. So these assassinations should actually be viewed as very key events in American political history. And as such, they deserve to be studied in depth, and the conspiracy behind it deserves to be unraveled so we can better understand who is behind these assassinations, and what the consequences were and what the intent was. And often the consequences were planned. And FDR said nothing, everything is planned in politics, nothing is a coincidence. FDR said that. Historians have done a very poor job, and that's the reason I wrote this book, is because historians have done a very poor job in covering these assassinations, and they're all often actually part of the cover up. And they don't, historians are trained to do critical investigations, and to do deep dives into the sources, and to try and unearth the buried truths. And they do that pretty well in certain areas of study, like African American history and stuff like that. You find a lot of good books by some very talented historians. But when you get into this realm, you find that the quality of the scholarship is very poor, and that they're really part of the cover up, and they're not scrutinizing these cases at all. Uh, on the other hand, there are independent uh, journalists and investigators, usually focused on one particular assassination, who've written, who've done a good job, but they're more on the margin. They're not. They don't usually hold academic credentials or teach in universities or work for major newspapers. But those books do exist, and my study does draw a lot on the work of previous investigators. Now, as far as the assassination, well, there are many. Yeah, one thing my book showed that there are so many, and this and so that by itself has an implication, as far as understanding the American political system. I think traditional political science often present these narratives, of American exceptionalism, that tries to analyze America as a democratic system to contrast with authoritarian states. And that's what the government wants people to think, so they can justify these supposed crusades for democracy. When really, if you look into it, the U.S. is not upholding democracy. Like in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government banned 17 political parties. It's not a democracy, and delayed the elections. But if you look at the American political system, if you look at these assassinations, the cover-ups, a lot of them are actually coup d'états. And we're not supposed to have coups in America. We're supposed to be a pure democracy, but in fact, we have these coups, uh, and we have all kinds of elite, scandals. So, my book. I mean, there are chapters on the Lincoln assassination, Warren Harding. There's strong evidence that Warren Harding was murdered by his own wife, Florence Harding, to protect him. She was always the protector of his career, and he was going to be implicated in a teapot, what amounted to the major political scandal before Watergate, the Teapot Dome scandal, that brought down a cabinet official involving bribery over oil leases. But it was much bigger, deeper corruption in the Harding administration, and related to the Ohio Gang, was a group that Harding had brought with him from Ohio, that was connected with the Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, and they basically were involved in an orgy of corruption. Some of it centered on prohibition, bribe taking, using the government for personal enrichment, everything being for sale in Washington, which would be familiar to our own time. And it was catching up with Harding, and so his and he did develop an illness, but his wife exploited that to the evidence would indicate, put poison in his drink. And then when the hotelier came who found who came into the room after Harding was reported dead and noticed a noxious odor from the drink and tried to grab the drink, so it'd be police evidence because the police were coming. Florence Harding grabbed her hand, grabbed the glass, poured out the drink, and smashed the glass and destroyed all the evidence before the police came. And then she was suspiciously killed a year later. And then she was found back in Ohio burning. Her house was like the chimney was always filled with smoke, and she was every night she was burning all these documents. And then she turned up dead a year after Warren's death, and the doctor also turned up dead. Their doctor turned up dead under mysterious circumstance. So I mean, and this is,
One
the
thing,
underside of American political life. Like we're taught as school kid, or if you go to college, how the Russian Revolution turned on its own, and Stalin was a murderer. But if you look deeply into American history, you find a lot of murder at the top levels. And this is just one case. I can go into a
one
lot of
thing,
cases, but go
one
ahead.
thing I just want to say in support of your book is this is not a highbrow book for historians. This is an accessible book for all Americans. And, the things that Jeremy brings to light are things that anyone with common sense would say, this makes no sense. So I just want to encourage all readers to get this book.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Gloria. Yeah, it's a history everybody should know. I mean, we should have more realistic understanding of our own country's history. It will lead us to be a little more humble because, we develop these kind of exceptionalist mantra that we're superior to everybody else. And look how bad the Russians are and the Chinese. And this justifies, America going into all these countries supposedly to be supporting democracy. But when you scrutinize American democracy, it doesn't look so democratic. There's again a lot of violence and intrigues. So yeah, I think it's an important history for everybody to understand. And there are a lot of juicy stories in there. I would hope maybe some Hollywood filmmakers might pick up the book. And that would be a great movie about Florence Harding. She reminds me of the Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because I read a few in researching this. I read some biographies of her, and she was presented as this domineering woman who stage managed Warren's entire career. And she was older than Warren Harding. And Warren Harding was like this. He was this like pretty boy who was just like not smart at all, but he appeared very well. Like he could give a very good speech. He was very photogenic, good looking, kind of like a Hollywood actor. And he was actually quite popular, but he was very shallow in his intellect and superficial, and a kind of very weak man. And Florence was the one controlling everything about him, including at the end, she decided to save him by killing him. So it's quite a poignant story, the drama there,
It seems
and
like she's more of a handler than a wife. I
yeah,
mean, what we've seen
absolutely.
a lot in these CIA situations is that often, someone is assigned to be someone's lover or wife or husband, and they're like the controlling, person.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think because Harry Doherty, and she may have been Harry Doherty also was he was the Attorney General who was very power ambition and crooked. He knew Harding, because they came up in Ohio, and they were tied with the Standard Oil empire. And Doherty was a very ambitious one, but he saw Harding was a good front man because he was so good looking, and he can appear well and give a good speech. So Doherty and Florence stage managed his career. But there's another intrigue, and there's like an Epstein type situation going on there too, because the editor of the Washington Post, Ned McLean, would host these parties with young girls, and Warren Harding went there, and like sometimes it got out of hand. And one night, they were like 3 a.m. and they were throwing bottles in the glass at this poor young woman, and she got killed. And Harding was there, and they had to scurry him out. And it was actually the whistleblower, and that it was the kind of stuff that could have been drudged up to ruin him. And the whistleblower in the story, there was a whistleblower, an FBI agent, who was hired by Florence Harding, named Gaston Mean, because Florence discovered Warren was having an affair with a pretty blonde woman who actually they had met as she was a poet, because Warren owned a newspaper, a small town newspaper, and she had submitted poetry. And apparently, like at the age of 15, she would come into the office, and she would sit on his lap, and he would like fondle her and fondle her breasts. And then when she was only 15, and they continued this affair, and he had an illegitimate child with her. And actually, Florence and Warren never had a child together. Florence had one son from a previous marriage. Uh, so, and then she hired this private investigator to examine this affair and corroborate the affair. And then he was the one, Gaston Means, wrote a book, The Strange Death of Warren Harding, pointing to Florence as having been the murderer. And then they framed him, J. Edgar Hoover framed him for a crime he didn't commit. And he ended up spending the rest of his life in prison. And even today, Means is ridiculed. There was an HBO series. Like, that's why this movie needs to be made to tell the true history, because HBO came out with a series, Boardwalk Empire. And guess who the bad guy is? Gaston Means, who was the one who actually was the whistleblower who exposed these Epstein type parties. And he actually, Means had been called in. He tried to save this woman. How Harding was a coward. When the woman got struck in the head and was gravely ill, his handlers skirted him out of there so he wouldn't be identified with it, and they were leaving her to die. And Gaston Means came and tried to rescue the woman, and he took her to the hospital. So he was actually a good guy. And then he testified before Congress on all this corruption going on, and he reported on Florence's role in murdering Warren, and he was maligned in history. All the historians wrote these, because Hoover took to the leading journals of that day, like Reader's Digest. He wrote an article smearing Means and said he was the worst criminal ever, to discredit him. And then he was set up for a crime he didn't commit, put in prison for the rest of his life. Historian continued to malign him. And then this HBO series from the 20 teens presented him as the bad guy and him as the murderer, when actually he was the whistleblower. And I did another article, and I touch on in the book that this is how whistleblowers are portrayed. They're demonized and maligned even generations later, and the historical record needs to be corrected, and more people need to stand up for whistleblowers who tell the truth. And that's the pattern shown in the book, that the whistleblowers and the truth teller, the investigators, get maligned and often set up for crime and smeared. So more people who are familiar with that history will stand up more for whistleblowers, because we see even in the alternative media, they rarely stand up for whistleblowers. They often fall prey to the dominant demonization narratives, and that's part of the cover up of state crimes.
I'm just looking over the list of all of you've got a lot. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Wow, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 22, 23. Oh, wow.
And these are ones that are just well
23,
documented.
23 different murders here. Maybe you can touch on a few of them that, we tend to cover these assassinations on our show, and we've done quite a few of them. We did Huey Long. We did John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy. We did Martin Luther King. We've done John Lennon. What else? Danny Casolero. We've done a lot on that. We always mention Gary Webb because he's got the 2 bullets, suicide. Who shoots themselves in the head twice to commit suicide. But there's some other ones that we really haven't touched on. I think we've done Paul Wellstone, right? We've done Paul Wellstone.
I'm not
We've
sure.
done Frank Olson.
One is Leo Ryan. One that should be better known is Leo Ryan sponsored some of the most far-reaching legislation in Congressman. He was one of the few sitting American congressmen to be murdered while he was in Congress. And he just happened to have written some of the most far-reaching legislation ever to try and rein in the CIA, the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, which basically established very strong congressional oversight over the CIA, and the CIA basically restricted the CIA from carrying out covert paramilitary operations unless they had congressional approval. And then, lo and behold, he was lured to Jonestown because he represented the district of the Jonestown cult, which was set up by Jim Jones, who was exposed as a CIA agent in Brazil, and had been an FBI undercover informant in the 1950s. And he set up this cult-like church in the Bay Area when they in the 70s, and he basically tried to draw on all these people who had been involved in the protest movements of the 60s, who wanted some religious mooring in their life, but it turned into more of a cult than a genuine church. And he bought this land in Jonestown, and lured people there to basically be part of this. It was supposed to be this, like, they thought they were going to this like model hippie commune, uh, and instead it was like a death chamber where they were drugged. They became targets for MK Ultra type experiments. And then Ryan got tipped off that some terrible things were going on in Jonestown, and he actually had developed. He was like a real progressive fighter in Congress, and he going after the CIA. And also, he got interested in the problem of religious cults, and he may have been aware that the CIA was using religious cults to continue MK Ultra. And apparently, his daughter got caught up in the cult. So he was the perfect person to investigate Jonestown, as constituents were telling him bad things were happening there. And so he was eventually able to go there as part of his investigation. He was lured there, and that's when they murdered him. And there was witnesses saw a tall man in army fatigues who assassinated him. Although they tried to scapegoat this guy, I forget his name. It's in the book. Layton, Larry Layton, was this ex-hippie whose family was involved with the Jonestown, was living there, and he was basically scapegoated and set up as the patsy. And people who knew him said, like, they had known Larry as a very vibrant and great guy, but the Larry Layton they saw after the murder, and at that time, because he was on the scene somehow, but he was like a drugged out zombie, and he had been targeted under MK Ultra experiments, and he was set up as the patsy, and he was ultimately fingered for Ryan's murder. But witnesses saw again this. It was a military operation, military special forces operation, and it was a tall man in army fatigues who was the actual assassin, not Larry Layton. And that's the pattern we see in many of these assassinations, that they set up a patsy, um, and often they are drugged out. Like Sirhan was subjected to hypnosis and targeted under the MK Ultra. We had the show, and more research is coming out through David Whalen's work, who we had on our show, about Mark David Chapman and John Lennon, how he was subjected to MK Ultra and hypnosis, and he was set up the patsy in the Lennon killing, but the real killer killed Lennon from much closer than where Chapman was. So there are all these parallels. Leighton was another one of these patsies, and that case, hopefully, my book would alert people about this case, and there may be more investigation or reopening of the legal case, and people should honor Leo Ryan. Not everyone who was assassinated was necessarily an honorable person. Like Warren Harding was not a good man. Not that he deserved to be murdered, but nobody deserves to be murdered. But Leo Ryan was genuinely a great man, and he was murdered. And there are some
Well,
other great
I,
men like Huey
I,
Long, Danny Casolaro.
I think it's important to also focus on the people who represented this imperial predator class, because people seem to think, oh, I'm a CIA director or I'm a CIA agent, I'm not going to get whacked. And I think it's very important to show that people who are on the inside, once they become not useful, are easily taken out. And in particular, I like the William Colby story, if you'd want to go over that, and Vince Foster. I don't really know that story very well. I don't think we've really discussed Vince Foster.
Sure, I'll be happy to. Yeah, and I make the point at the end of the book that, again, we learn in school children or in college that the Soviet Union, the revolution turned on its own, but we don't learn about how the American state is actually not that dissimilar from the Soviet Union, and that they turned on its own people. And those are two good examples you're bringing up, the William Colby case and the Vince Foster case. So to go into those cases, William Colby was the CIA director who headed the Phoenix operation, which was a murderous program, and then he testified before Congress. He felt that to save the CIA, he had to testify because already a lot of stuff had come out. So he felt that he should testify, and there would be a house cleaning. And of course, it was kind of limited hangout. He would admit to certain things to bury the even darker secrets and to protect some even more sinister operations like this Jonestown. So he testified, and that made him a lot of enemies. Some of the CIA old guard saw him as a traitor. Uh, but then he knew all these kind of secrets. And he was also involved with the Nugan Hand Bank. He was a counsel to the Nugan Hand Bank, which was a drug money laundering operation that started in the late phase of the Indochina War as a way to launder the drug money that was being used to finance the Hmong army in a secret war in Laos that the CIA was waging, an assassination program like Phoenix, and a counterpart program headed by Theodore Shackley in Laos, where they killed hundreds of politicians. Um, and Colby, another motive, though, after he left, he retired as CIA director from the CIA. He was hired by the Nebraska. I found out in my research, and this may have been the definite motive behind his murder, was that he was hired as a consultant, an investigator for by the Nebraska state legislature when they were investigating a pedophilia scandal that encapsulated members of the high-level members of the Republican Party, and possibly even George H.W. Bush, who was rumored to be a pedophile. And then there was, and one of his old Phoenix buddies, a Phoenix operative who is now in the Nebraska state legislature, John DeCamp, worked with Colby on that investigation, which was revealing some really ugly stuff, perhaps linked with the Epstein honeypot and pedophilia rings. And then there was a guy, Gary Cardori, who was a private investigator whose plane crashed under very mysterious circumstances. And Colby was sent to investigate the crash, and he came to the conclusion that there was foul play in the plane crash that killed Cardori and his 9-year-old son. And he hadn't yet publicly reported that, but he privately felt that and was in the process of writing up a report about that was going to be delivered to the Nebraska state legislature and become public. And at that point, he was murdered. And the scene of the crime made clear it was a murder because Colby was a very meticulous man who planned out his daily steps and was very cautious and conservative. And they claimed that he was eating dinner because his home was found with a half-eaten meal and a half bottle of wine, and like the radio was on, and it was like it was dusk, and the weather was bad. But and he was found dead in his canoe, and so they claim that he took an ill-fated canoe ride and drowned. But anybody who knew him said Colby would not just leave a half-eaten meal to go for a canoe ride as it's getting dark on a stormy night. It doesn't fit with his personality, and a very, very cautious guy would never do that. And then the other oddity was that the body wasn't found right away. They couldn't find his body, and he supposedly went on this canoe ride and drowned. There was no body, but then the body turned up a week later in the spot of the canoe. So somebody took the body, obviously, and then brought it back. Um, and that's just among the things. So,
Kind of
it's
reminds me
clear
of
that he was
Obama's
murdered.
chef.
Yeah. And then the Vince Foster case. Yeah, I mean, again, here the state taking out one of its own. Foster, and this related to the Mina scandal because Foster was the White House counsel, Bill Clinton, but he had a long history with the Clintons, and he was rumored, and I think there's evidence that he was the lover of Hillary Clinton, and he was a partner at the Rose Law Firm. And Foster was an all-American type guy. Very successful attorney, tall, good-looking guy who made partner at the Rose Law Firm. So he was an Arkansas guy, and Clinton Bill was the governor of Arkansas in the '80s. and Hillary became partner at the Rose Law Firm, and that was the most prestigious law firm in Little Rock. And she and Vince Foster were partners and allegedly lovers. And the clients of the Rose Law Firm included people like Jackson Stevens, was this hedge fund manager. And if you go in Little Rock, even now, Stevens is the biggest firm. As you drive into the city, you see the tallest building there, Stevens. It's this huge hedge fund and a very wealthy company owned by Jackson Stevens, who lo and behold had connection to the CIA. And he also owned a lot of the area banks. And that's where the money was laundered, because he had the MENA armed drug smuggling operation. Because Bill Clinton was a CIA asset from his time at Oxford. He had been recruited with his roommate Strobe Talbot, who came from an old CIA family, for a mission into Soviet Russia to smuggle Nikita Khrushchev's diaries, had been informant in the anti-war movement. And he was, Winthrop Rockefeller was the governor of Arkansas in the 60s, and he took Clinton under his wing. And there was a family connection. Rockefeller's war buddy was related to Clinton's mother. That may be how he got in their notice. And Clinton did have a lot of political talents. I think they saw that he was talented as far as giving speeches and winning the room and something. He knew how to speak to different audiences, even if he was lying all the time. But he made people seem like he was on their side. Like the regular folk in Arkansas, he knew how to talk to them. But he was a con man. They over time they understood, but it took time before they realized that he was a con man. Anyway, so with the Rose Law Firm, Clinton was a CIA asset, so Arkansas was a key state for the Iran-Contra. They used Arkansas as a base for armed and gun running and drug smuggling operations to support the Contra rebel, these right-wing terrorists who are intent on sabotaging the Sandinista revolution, a socialist revolution in Nicaragua. And Congress had barred aid to the Contras, so they have to move underground, and that's why there were these criminal activity, and the banks were key for all the money laundering, and it was the clients of the Rose Law Firm, Jackson Stevens. It was his banks that the money was going through, so he was a crucial guy, and his lawyer was Vince Foster and Hillary Clinton. So, and then when Clinton got to the White House, he brought Foster with him as his chief counsel. But he knew all the secrets and all the dirty deeds of the Clintons. Um, and then he had a falling out with them, and it's still a bit murky exactly what happened. He may have. There's one evidence and one theory that he was blackmailed by the Israeli Mossad. Um, and then that became a threat because of that blackmail operation. Whatever the case, it's clear he was murdered. He was found and the book goes into details about. I mean, the official story, because he was found in a park right near Langley headquarters, allegedly, shot himself in this park, but the crime scene evidence just didn't match. Like what you're saying, in a lot of these cases, it doesn't take a high intelligence. Anybody who just looks into the case, just the basic facts of the case never don't make sense. Like, there was no blood. He supposedly shot himself, but there was no blood around him. And like the gun was found, I can't remember every last detail because I covered so many cases, and some of the chapters may have been written several years ago, but I just,
And it blends together a bit because there is a lot of similarities between them.
yeah.
How
And then
about
the media, if I can add, like with the Foster, the media then like went into high gear that this was a suicide. And the worst media I found was often the liberal media, and like the more liberal commentator. Like I quote this guy Lewis, who is known as a dove on Vietnam. He was known as the New York Times liberal columnist for years, Anthony Lewis, and he had been against the Vietnam War, although he said it was, good intentions gone awry. He doesn't want to get into the real motives behind it, but he was known as the liberal. But he came out, like I quoted him in my chapter, as an example of the liberal media coverage of this. They're just like mocking anyone who suggested, and like he mocked Oliver Stone. I mean, he tied it with the Kennedy. He's like mocking anyone who thinks Foster was murdered as like a lunatic, just like Oliver Stone concocted these wild theories about the JFK. So that's how the New York Times presents it. And there are other articles like in the Washington Post. It actually was the same guy involved in the smear campaign against Gary Webb was involved with the Vin Foster case, Walter Pincus, who was later uncovered as a Mockingbird journalist, a CIA asset, and like he titled his column, "Suicide." And anyone who thinks otherwise is insane. And of course, he admits all the facts. And he draws on like the government cover-up report. Like the government often will have a commission, like the Warren Commission, or they appoint an investigator to file an official report, and it's a total whitewash and ignores all the crime scene evidence. But then the media just said, "Oh, this is authoritative, this report," and anyone who diverts from that report is a lunatic, and they're blacklisted. They're barred from the media, barred from academia. In fact, and I have a small section of how academia just followed suit, and all these professors just promoted the same narrative as the media. And everybody's a conspiracy theorist or a right-wing nut. They attribute it only to these right-wing lunatics. When the evidence is so clear, when you look even into the basic facts of the case, and there are about 3 or 4 good books now written about the Foster case, including by a guy named David Martin, but they're either like self-published or the very small presses, and they're never reviewed in the main, New York Times review, or they're not, quoted by mainstream historians or journalists. But if you pick up a copy of those books, it sets a very high standard as far as the research and logic of these authors.
Well, we've found from social engineering standpoint and psyops that repetition is key and having a uniform message. So if all media comes out at the same time with the same story, and we're talking print, we're talking television, we're talking radio, and now social media, if it all has the same exact message, and then, there's this kind of fakeness between, let's say, left media and right media, but basically when it comes to a prevailing narrative, they're pretty much, on board that someone has committed suicide. They don't start, really pulling it apart in the mainstream media. So I think that's something to also look for when you're getting this message, this repetitive message over and over and over again. It's time to stand back and say, why are they ramming this down our throats everywhere, and not letting anything else breathe, because it makes you remember something that didn't happen. And, you recall it, 20 years later, and you think that you understood what was going on when all you really understood was a repeated lie. You also
Absolutely.
have,
And if I could add to that,
yeah,
that builds
please.
off the model of propaganda adopted by Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist, who said, if you repeat the big lie over and over again, people will believe it. And Goebbels learned from a master propagandist, Woodrow Wilson, who hired Sigmund Freud's nephew, who understood mass psychology, to develop
Bernays.
the Creel Committee during World War I, because most of the American public had no interest in going to involving themselves in the European conflict and sending their own children to die in a war that was started by corrupt European powers fighting for themselves for control over the world. So Wilson had to enact a mass propaganda campaign, and he enlisted Sigmund Freud's nephew, and then that became the model for Goebbels, and Goebbels is attributed to that quote, and that's what you see. And people do believe it, even very highly educated and otherwise highly intelligent and often highly progressive. They may be very, very progressive on a lot of the issues, but when you address this stuff, they've basically been the victim of these. Uh, and you can't have a rational conversation with them. And they become closed-minded to actually exploring any of the evidence.
Well, they're smart. The psychiatrists and the psychologists are very smart, and they understand that people want to believe that their government is good. They want to believe their parents are good. They want to believe their police force are good. People want to believe these things because it gives kind of a sense of well-being and order. And it's kind of alarming to really understand that the people who have so much power are not, well-intentioned, that are evil and, and criminal. So I think, they understand that. So they twist things in a way that the people who are asking the questions become, the targets, that, it's the truth teller, it's the whistleblower that is, all of a sudden locked away and on trial. And I recall you've given us the example in several occasions of truth tellers that were institutionalized because they didn't want this particular message to get out there, so they would make these fictitious cases against them that they were insane and they had to be taken away. I forgot one of the ones that you had brought up, but it was very powerful.
Yeah, that was the case with Jessica Fields. Her nephew wrote a book telling her story, because she got wind of the plot against Huey Long in Louisiana in the 1930s. And Huey Long was one of the most progressive politicians. He was a real left winger who came out of the left wing milieu. His father had been in the socialist movement, which had a reach in the southern states, people forget, in the 19 teens, 1920s. And there was a huge inequality and poverty, and Long really championed the common man. And like Clinton, he knew how to speak to people. Like, he was a talented politician, but the difference is Clinton was a liar, because the AFL-CIO head said of Clinton, he'll pat you on the back and piss down your leg. But Huey Long was a genuine guy. Like, he was, he knew how to talk to the regular people out in the rural areas and working class people, to relate to them, but he followed through on his promises, and he did a lot. He's the most popular governor in the history of Louisiana. If you go to Louisiana, they love Huey Long. He delivered for them. He built roads. He invested in education. He built up the LSU, Louisiana State University. He went after the Standard Oil, and he got into the U.S. Senate. And he was making a run he was going to challenge FDR from the left in the 36 election. And so he was a big threat. And they took him out. And there was a plot. And this woman got wind of a plot. They had a meeting in this fancy New Orleans hotel. And they drew straws as to who was going to carry it out. And she reported on it. And then there was stuff going on where she was living in Baton Rouge that she got wind of. And so they couldn't have that. They wanted to advance this narrative that this disgruntled medical doctor was a lone gunman. They set him up, and he was himself murdered uh, with the same bullets that killed Long. How could he have shot it? And his gun was different. And actually, they planted a gun later, but they planted the wrong gun, so it was the wrong bullets, and he was killed with the same bullet because the bodyguard shot Long and they shot him, the doctor, and they set him up. And she said this, she knew all this. And so, since she had credible information and people would take her seriously, the only thing they could do was label her as insane. And they put her in they said she was mentally unfit and insane. They initiated legal proceedings against her, and they put her in a mental asylum. And the poor woman was forced to stay in that mental asylum. She lived to an old age for like 40 or 50 years. And then her nephew wrote a book about it, exposing what happened. But most historians don't even pay attention to that. And a leading liberal historian at Columbia University, I plan to email him, we'll see what kind of guy he is, because he wrote, "Oh, the doctor killed Huey Long." And there's massive evidence that that's simply not the case. And he leaves out of the history book, so students don't learn about these stories and that kind of injustice. And yeah, if we know that kind of history, we would be more sympathetic to and so standing up for whistleblowers and not allow them to be maligned, because we've seen that in more recent contexts, like this Netflix film, with the Danny Casolaro case. The Netflix film maligns by these two, as Peter Osborne called them, clowns, who made a lot of money and won an Emmy Award, but they demonized two very honorable people Bill Hamilton and Michael Reconnaisudo, who are whistleblowers in the case of the CIA's involvement of the theft of computer software that Bill Hamilton helped develop, who's a man of extremely high integrity, who's won all his legal cases, and also a computer genius who had his software stolen from him by the CIA. And then they have all this information about the murder by the CIA elements of Danny Casolaro. And then Netflix tries to paint them as being crazy and insane to discredit all the thing they've exposed about the corruption at the high levels of the American government and CIA. So it continues to this day, and that won an Emmy. And these guys are living very lavish lifestyle. And Hamilton and Reconnaisudo are poorly treated, just like this wonderful woman, Jessica Fields. And that's
Well, we
not right. Anyone should not allow for that.
we also have a show coming up where we're going to go into, what was it, the CIA 100 on universities and professors, and I think they came out with, there were thousands that were professors that the CIA positioned in I think it was 100 universities or something like that. Do you want to
Well,
talk
we
a
are
little
going
bit
to be
about that?
discussing that. Yeah, I have an article coming out about dozens of professors who are tied with the NED, which is the CIA front propaganda agency. And yeah, historically, it's documented that there are a ton of professors who've worked for the CIA in various capacities. And that may be why, because, yeah, as I pointed at the beginning, the historians have covered this topic abysmally. Like, I reviewed all the books and all the
So it's
ones
not
published by,
accidental. It's not accidental. It's
yeah,
not like
exactly.
they just didn't get the memo. It's that they are positioned because they're loyal to not telling the truth to the American
Yeah,
public and
and
to
that's why
students.
students and the public don't know the real history. And it's important to try and tell that history, and we can learn from that history in various ways, including ways you're discussing.
And it's also why professors such as Jeremy Kuzmarov, who is a fantastic professor and researcher and historian. It's you can't tell the truth and get a good job these days. It's really
Yeah, it is
it's
one of the
really
most
rough.
corrupt. That's one thing I learned, and I was very naive about, that this is one of the most corrupt professions, and one of the most corrupt people are in that profession, and some truly vile people. And that's because he who controlled the past controlled the present. And you have this corrupt ruling oligarchy, and they can't allow for the full truth, American political history, to come to light, because it will result in more and more people who are awakened politically and will be emboldened to demand change and to stand up for persecuted people, and to stand up for exposing the truth. And they're continuing to engage in state crimes and assassination. The Charlie Kirk. The last chapter addresses the Charlie Kirk case. Very clearly, that was a cover up and a conspiracy behind that. The Epstein case, again, when they're turning, well, we don't know. I mean, maybe they helped save Epstein and sent him to a private island, or he was assassinated because he
What
knew
you're
too
talking
much.
about is the concept of extraction, and very often we see in CIA ops or things of that nature where the person is extracted and they kind of fake a death.
It's possible. The other possibility is they took him out. He was expendable, and he knew too much. The trial would be a threat, because clearly he didn't commit suicide. And my book goes into some of the evidence, and it's based in part on. And one thing I do in the book is try and always provide good evidence, because uh, to show that where the facts lie. And this is not a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is Russiagate. That the irony is that the people who attack credible investigators and researchers for being conspiracy theorists are themselves the worst conspiracy theorists. A ludicrous conspiracy theory was the Russiagate, and that was promoted in respectable newspapers, respectable academic journals, by all these Ivy League professors. They are true conspiracy theorists, because there's no evidence that has emerged whatsoever to indicate that Donald Trump, the most right wing president in recent history was a Russian agent. And in fact, all the declassified documents that are coming out show that even the FBI and U.S. intelligence agencies had no evidence of that, and that they misled the public. So all these people crying conspiracy theory are themselves the conspiracy theorists. And my book is rooted in sound research and evidence and facts. And that's what I was trained to do. I had very good training at Brandeis University and McGill University. I was trained to do research, to marshal good evidence, to build an argument rooted in fact and good, deep research. And that's what I've tried to do in this book. And people can judge for themselves. But I think there is a lot of evidence in each chapter that would verify what I'm arguing. So in some cases, we don't know for sure exactly how the murder transpired, but it's clear there was a cover-up, and it's clear some of the people involved, like Lyndon Johnson, very clearly was involved in the Kennedy assassination. I think there's an absolute mountain of evidence about that. So
I think there's also the common sense element. I think you come at things, from a real common sense standpoint. I mean, things have to add up. 2 and 2 doesn't all of a sudden become 10 just because it's a convenient thing for the, predator class or the elite to get away with. So, I mean, we can always just use common sense. And I think a lot of the stories you do include these, really fascinating details as to, to what happened. And I think the reader can say, hey, that it doesn't make sense to commit suicide by jumping through a glass sealed window. I mean, if you're going to jump out the window yourself, you're not going to hit yourself on the head first and have blunt force trauma and then throw yourself out through the hotel window, closed glass window, so.
Yeah, and in that case, when experts said it would require a running start because it was thick glass that you can't just penetrate unless you're running basically like Usain Bolt type Olympic level speed. Maybe then you could penetrate that glass if you have a leaping start running at that kind of speed. And nobody heard, in that case, Frank Olson running through the hotel in the middle of the night when he allegedly jumped out. And then the investigation, years later, when the Sun reopened the investigation and hired a top forensic expert, found that the cause of death was caused by a blunt force trauma to the head, and that he was hit over the head with an object. And then they broke the glass themselves and threw him out. So,
and then there's the CIA's own manual that explicitly tells you before you throw someone out a window, you give them blunt force trauma in the head. There's actually, a smoking gun manual that explains how to do it.
Yeah,
So,
it's not really a mystery, or it takes a rocket scientist to put 2 and 2 together. When the CIA writes an assassination manual and the murder follows it almost to a T, and then when they say, but call it a suicide, only an idiot would actually believe that, and yet somehow they've convinced some very intelligent people to believe that and to attack researchers who point out the obvious.
well, I think the more we look at this, the more we see that those people are on some payroll. And that's how they've got their illustrious position, is because they will repeat the narrative that is approved, whether or not it's true.
Probably, yes, or they're intimidated. I think what you find in universities, they're not in the direct payroll, but they know their career depends on it. They're not going to be promoted. They're not going to get a permanent position at Columbia or Harvard or Yale unless they smear the whistleblower, unless they repeat the false government narrative.
Well, Jeremy, I think we're out of time. So let me just give you a few moments to remind our audience how they can follow your work and purchase your book.
Sure. The book is available at Clarity Press and Amazon, and also on my website, jeremykuzmarov.com, has all my 8 books. And you can find me at Too Hot for the Mainstream on Substack and Covert Action Magazine.
The opinions you hear are ours and not those of WBAI or the Pacifica Foundation. This content is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as professional, medical, or legal advice. Listeners are encouraged to form their own opinions. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria Guillo, joined here by Professor Jeremy Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter X, and Podbeam. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you next week.
All right.
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap for the for the show today. We could probably do 2 or 3 shows on this to go in
Yeah.
depth on some of these assassinations, but it's a pattern, and it's been repeating over and over and over for.
Can you just
decades.
add something for our audience on James Forrestal? I don't really know that one. America's first defense secretary is suicided.
Sure, yeah. James Forrestal, yeah, with the first defense secretary. And yeah, again, they committed. I think, well, he was not a progressive by any stretch. In fact, he was a Cold War hardliner with extreme right wing views. He had a background in Wall Street. Henry Wallace said his blood hands were stained with blood with oil. He was tied with the oil industry, but he was critical of the Truman administration policy toward Israel because he felt that if the U.S. aligned too closely with Israel, it would alienate the Arab states and affect the ability of the U.S. to extract the oil, what he called the oil treasure. And also, he was involved. He knew a lot about the Pearl Harbor cover-up. There was a major cover-up, which I think we've addressed on the show, in the FDR administration, which had cracked the Japanese diplomatic code and had provoked the Japanese and then had advanced forewarning of the Pearl Harbor attack and failed to properly alert the Hawaiian naval commanders who were scapegoated and only exonerated decades later. Their reputation was restored only in the 1990s. He knew all this insider stuff, and he was about to be publishing a diary and memoir, and then that was a threat. And that memoir, when it eventually came out after his death, was heavily redacted and rewritten by a ghostwriter who actually praised, like people who knew Forrestal said that's not him because it praised he knew he hated George Marshall. George Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff, famous for the Marshall Plan. He knew how corrupt Marshall was, and Marshall was the central figure in the Pearl Harbor cover up. Uh, and he had a rivalry with Marshall, and yet this re-release memoir had all these words of praise for George Marshall. And they're like, and his brother said this, and all these other people that James would have never written that. And it's actually the same with the Vince Foster. You find these parallels because they produced a suicide note by Vince Foster, and like people who knew him said Vince would never wrote that. It was like the suicide note said the Clintons did nothing wrong. They should not be investigated. And here's a devoted family man, like who loved his kids. He was a great father. He had some, I think maybe he wasn't the greatest husband, like affairs and stuff, but he still did love his wife, and he particularly loved his kids and was devoted father. His kids loved him. And if he had committed suicide, he would have written a note, to his kids, and but it was just two
How did he
lines
die?
praising the Clinton. That's Vince Foster. They shot him and they planted him in this park and then claimed he shot himself, but there's no blood. And like the gun was like too far for him to have shot himself. Like the gun was found like far away. And, I mean,
Right.
like he would never write a suicide note praising the Clintons, and he had all this, knew all the corruption of the Clintons. So it's like the same with Forrestal. They twisted.
How did he do it? I don't
And then
recall.
Forrestal, they had him admitted into a mental asylum in Washington. They claimed he went insane and that he was found in the streets saying the Russians are coming. Like they claimed he was caught by police in his underwear in the middle of the night, saying the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. That he'd been like paranoid, but like, and I actually believe that story. I used to tell that to students that like look, the Cold War drove people insane. Look what happened to Forrestal. But then I was reading, I think, the Martin book, and he pointed out that that story was made up. you see these columnists, or the corrupt one, Drew Pearson was supposedly this muckraking columnist in Washington. He was the one that reported that. And David Martin said that that story was made up. They needed a cover story to give reason to admit him to this insane asylum, and that's where they could kill him. And he was put on a high floor, and they threw him out. But they claimed he tried to hang himself, and then like it failed, so he jumped out the window, like with a noose still around his neck. But then there was an investigation, and the investigation was kept classified for over 50 years. But finally, it was released in like 2005. This death happened in 1949. 2005, researcher David Martin, through Freedom of Information Act, was succeeded in getting it declassified, and it revealed that there were signs of a struggle next to his bed, that there was broken glass and blood around his bed. So he was clearly beaten and killed on his bed, and then thrown out, and then it was staged to make it look like he tried to kill himself. So that's example devouring their own, because he was the nation's first, after World War II, the first defense secretary. When they renamed, it used to be the Department of War. Now they've gone back to the Department of War, but it was changed to Department of Defense. But and he wasn't the progressive, but he knew insider information like some of these other people, like Frank Olson was a whistleblower and an insider, and Epstein. So.
Yeah, when they're done with you, they're done with you, folks.
Yeah.
There's no protection there.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to give our video audience a little bonus. So thanks.
I think a good
My
movie that
pleasure.
goes along with this subject would be Arlington Road, and it shows you how they twist like the narrative to like blame the person who's actually trying to expose something
Hmm.
for the problem, and
Yeah.
you get a lot of that with these political assassinations. I highly recommend that movie if you can find it. It's actually quite difficult to find online these days. But okay, so do we think that's a wrap for today?
I think
We're ready to
so.
get out of here. All
Yeah,
right,
thanks
that's
everybody.
good. Maybe we can come back to this one again because I'm sure there's a ton of stories to talk about.
I just want to say one thing. We're not laughing. I mean, it's terrible if someone is murdered. It's really terrible. It's what kind of makes us chuckle is just the extreme way that these murders are done, and then they're said that they're not murders. It's just
Yeah.
I mean, like you're
Absurdity.
jumping out a window to kill yourself with a rope around your neck because the hanging failed. I mean, so I just want to say, I mean,
Yeah. And then the
you
crimes,
feel
it
for
takes
all the
50 years to
families.
release these documents, but it shows that there were, major struggle around his bed, and blood and glass. So it's so obvious.
It's the
Um
absurdity that we're laughing at, not
Yeah,
the
it's the
sadness
absurdity, and then you
of
have these
the.
historians who fail to report all that. They even when the evidence comes out, it's like what we were discussing with the germ warfare. That was a good episode, and I brought up, what about the historian now? Now we have this definitive proof, even from the CIA's documents. Is there any change in the textbooks or
Nope.
what these professors are writing about in the journals or academic book or telling students? And the answer is no. They ignore when the factual evidence comes to light, including government reports. They don't pay any attention. Either they're incompetent or they're just part of continued cover up. And that's unfortunately what you find. I worked in academia, and it's just been disgusting to see what really goes on there. And that's an area I was a bit naive. I thought academics were more, and that's why I entered the profession. And I respected some of my professors to out there to get the truth and help inform students so they could do better in the next generation. But we find, unfortunately, the opposite.
I think it's also getting worse. I mean, I had some great professors when I was in college and graduate school, and I think that, people are just being taken out. And I went back to my alma mater, which my undergrad, which was SUNY Old Westbury, and basically all the teachers were too old, so they're gone. But they didn't replace them with this type of professor. They replaced them with people who were going to teach them how to be a nurse. Very very practical education, not this kind of liberal art education, which is more generalist, which teaches you how to think and how to, use critical analysis, but more how do you turn out a worker that will basically be stuck paying off their student loans and can't ask any questions, just will, have to go right into the workforce until they age out of it. And then, they're pretty much, washed up. So anyway, I think it's getting progressively worse.
Yeah, and then in the humanity, they've been hammered with budget cuts, and then the people that are left the younger people are totally intimidated. That's what I've seen because they can't get a job. It's a very, very tight job market, and if they're controversial in any way, I mean, the whole field is supposed to be controversial. It's supposed to awaken students and challenge dominant paradigms, but it's become they've been intimidated. And so the younger faculty, you don't find publications. If you survey the publications coming out of younger faculty, they're not addressing the topics we're addressing on our show. And if they do, the rare cases they do, they're just following the official story because of intimidation in a lot of cases.
When I wrote an article for Covert Action magazine on the climate issue, talking about tax credits and carbon capture and all of that, and how corrupt that whole process is. I found that young professors were saying that basically they had to kowtow to this climate change narrative with CO2 as the villain. And, if they didn't, they wouldn't get any funding. So, they got creative, and, you could be writing about, rodents. And as long as you put in the word and climate change, you got funding for it. And, what Jeremy and I found in particular was that the older scientists, people who were no longer dependent on the system, especially physicists, were willing to buck the CO2 narrative, and, very well, I must say. So, yeah, it's a burden, and you might not even repeat the lie, but you can't expose the lie, or you don't get tenure, you don't get security.
Yeah, and liberal arts is designed to encourage independent and critical thinking. So whatever the topic, you may, and that's good research. Good research. What I've found often in projects I've taken up is that I had a certain narrative in my head about the way things were, and then when I looked into it deeply, I found that narrative was wrong. And Marshall had a lot of evidence in my own head. There was abundance of evidence, like with this assassination stuff. When I was younger, I just went along with the standard narrative. And then, I got into these topics and started reading more and doing in-depth research. And it totally challenged my own way of thinking. And I would think that there's a ton of evidence that people who would objectively read my book with an open mind would be convinced. Would think the way I come to think on this topic based on all that evidence. So, and that's what we encourage students to do, is to think for themselves and do their own research and come to their own conclusions. And yes, it may challenge the standard narrative, sometimes on both the left and right. As you're saying, Gloria, it's good to be independent because although personally I identify with the left on a lot of issues, but sometimes when you look into this stuff, the left narrative is flawed, and then people on the left don't like to, they're invested in that narrative, and they won't give you the time of day when you poke some holes that they're thinking, or you present evidence that develops an alternative analysis. They don't give you the time of day, or they blacklist. So the left groups are often as bad as the mainstream media. And that's something I think we need to try and push back on. Those of us who are more on the left, who are trying to build up alternative media, should demand that it is really a real alternative media that is open-minded and open to exploring these issues, and open to iconoclastic interpretation if there's good grounding behind them. And that's good journalism and good scholarship. That's the model. It shouldn't be ideologically driven always.
But what we've discovered is the left and the right are both infiltrated. And they're infiltrated by the same people with just different orientations, because the more we disagree with each other, then we're pointing our fingers at the left or we're pointing our fingers at the right, and we're not pointing our fingers up at who controls both.
That's
So,
true.
and I have to say, doing this show once a week has really opened my eyes to stuff that I believed as a kid that I no longer do, because we've really gotten into the weeds and really exposed it. And and folks, it is a painful process in a way, because you're literally like ripping off band-aids of scar tissue that you have like open wounds underneath, and you really have to take it off to heal. And sometimes you just have to rip it off and let the air get in and clean it, and then you can really move on. So yeah, there might be some ouch when you learn something that you thought was true isn't, but you grow from that, and then having that protects you when something else comes up. Because just for example, my views on the C-19 situation, I knew what was going on, not because of any greatness, but because I had studied the bioweapons program in the United States, and I saw what was done to, especially African communities, what was done to prisoners, what was done to other countries with germ warfare. So when the C-19 narrative came up, I was like, oh, I really had figured it out way before it happened. So understanding these things can protect you from harm in the future. So it's good to also know these things, even if they're not as pleasant as you'd like, because it can save your life. So just take that bandage off.
The hardest part, though, is when you learn the truth about something and everybody else still believes the lie, and they think
Good point.
you're the crazy one. And it's just like you just look at them like you're just asleep, and what do? You just bite your tongue, not say anything, or you try to wake them up, and the people kick you out of their lives. It's real tough. But and then eventually some of them will come around to realize, oh, that person, they were right. But it takes time, and that's the hardest part to deal with, I really think.
Yeah, you're right. It is a bit isolating. So then the goal is that you have to go out and make new friends.
Yeah, you really do.
And just I don't know, in my own personal life, I try not to ram my ideas down, my high school friends or my junior high friends. I mean, it's just you can say what you think, you can say it once, and if people are receptive, then you can continue. If people aren't receptive, it's not worth alienating yourself from everyone in your life or family over ideas. I think we're more
Especially
than
when
that.
we're trying to unify people to fight this.
Exactly.
You don't want to like push those people away. It's really difficult. All right.
Now we
Are
better
we ready?
call it
Let's
now.
go
I've
ahead
gotta
and
run,
wrap
yeah.
this thing up and get out of here. Did you have something
Okay.
else to say, Jeremy?
No, I've got to go. Yeah.
All right.
Oh, thank you. That
So-
was a great show. Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
fun.
it's really good. It's a really, really good topic.
Buy that
And,
book, everybody. Buy Jeremy's
yeah,
book.
definitely, and I might even grab this one from my nephew, but he might be a little too young. But I don't know, maybe 1 year. So
Never too early to discuss assassinations.
yeah, well, I mean, he's he's still a teenager, so he's
Okay,
on
I've
the
got to
edge.
run,
He's on the
guys.
edge.
Take care. I've got an appointment.
All right.
soon.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And thanks, Pasta Jardula. He's the executive producer of this show. We'll be back again next week with another episode. See you then. Bye-bye.